This is Sherwood Forest, Nottinghamshire. Nestled in the centre of England, it is home to the legend of Robin Hood. Popular as ever, Robin helps to attract around 500,000 visitors every year. His adventures still spark the imagination. But his story has evolved over the centuries. And now, the genesis of his character is almost completely obscured by the folk-tale hero he has become. Searching the archives, historians have discovered multiple references to real Robin Hoods. Graham Phillips has spent years investigating medieval documents.
The legend of Robin Hood probably brought about more books, poems and films and television series than any other character in English history. To try and find a real Robin Hood, then what you've really got to do is to find the earliest reference to Robin Hood, whether it's fictional or in historical records.
Robin Hood's legend first appears in the Middle Ages. Few people can read, so stories are spread by minstrels singing ballads. They tell of the outlaws Robin and Little John, living free in the forest, fighting the evil Sheriff of Nottingham. It's a time of poverty and oppression, and the people take Robin to their hearts. There are few written accounts of Robin's deeds, but two of the early ballads that have survived hold clues to his identity. The first is Robin Hood and the Monk. It is over 500 years old. Set in St Mary's Church in the centre of Nottingham, it's where our investigation begins. Pauline Miller has documented the church's past.
The connection of Robin Hood with St Mary's Church appears in a 14th century ballad called Robin Hood and the Monk. Robin Hood came into Nottingham on his own and was kneeling in St Mary's Church when a monk recognised him because Robin and his merry men had robbed him in the forest. The monk quietly left the church, walked down the street to the sheriff's house and told him where he was. The sheriff brought his men, arrested Robin and threw him in the prison cave. But fortunately Little John knew where he'd been and they rescued Robin and disappeared back into the forest.
Today, St Mary's Church is surrounded by buildings. But in Robin Hood's day, Sherwood Forest came right up to the city. It was a dangerous woodland. Highwaymen, thieves and poachers roamed its 400 square kilometres. The perfect place for medieval bandits to pick off better equipped soldiers. It's where the ballad pits Robin and his loyal band of merry men against their nemesis, the Sheriff of Nottingham. Although Robin Hood and the Monk sets Robin in a real time when outlaws marauded through these forests. The verses where Robin prays in St Mary's Church casts doubt over its accuracy. This building is only finished after the ballad is written. But many years later, during work to strengthen the columns, architects found that St Mary's had a predecessor.
There's one spot, and one spot only, where you can see a piece of the old Norman church. And it's at the base of this pillar here. And here it is.
The foundations date back to the 1100s. They prove an earlier church did stand here well before the ballad. So Robin could indeed have prayed at St Mary's. Close by is an even more compelling piece of evidence of Robin's presence. Only 20 metres from the church is the old county jail, now the Galleries of Justice Museum. It's a labyrinth of underground caves and has been voted the most haunted place in Britain. Curator Gary Holmes has made a remarkable discovery that could well be the vault where the ballad says Robin was locked up.
Basically, we're in a cave system that is the very sort of lowest part of the Galleries of Justice. The Galleries of Justice used to be the county jail for the Shire of Nottingham.
This is where ordinary prisoners are held. But the latest find is a special cell for captives like Robin. It's called an oubliette, and it's a deep pit below all the other prison caves. From the French oublier, meaning to forget, convicts are lowered down by rope and left to starve to death. It is pitch black and escape-proof.
At this point, we'll actually be standing in the neck of, if you can imagine the oubliette being in the shape of a wine bottle, actually standing in the neck of the wine bottle here, and then as the neck falls away to the shoulder of the wine bottle, the floor that we're standing on, there would be sort of 10 to 15 feet before we actually dropped and hit the floor of the oubliette.
In the Ballad of Robin Hood and the Monk, Robin is thrown into a prison pit. But it also specifically claims that when he's rescued, his men hang down a rope for him to climb up. This method of escape is the only way out of an oubliette.
The fact that we've discovered an oubliette recently on our site, and the fact that we are a mere 20 yards away from St Mary's Church, we strongly believe that the oubliette we found is quite probably the oubliette that Robin Hood was incarcerated in.
There is another surviving ballad, which also holds clues to the identity of a real Robin. It's called The Little Jester of Robin Hood. In this narrative, Robin has a hometown. Most people think Robin comes from Nottingham, but it recounts how he's from the neighbouring county of Yorkshire.
At the end of The Little Jester of Robin Hood, we're told that he's been wounded and he's taken to a priory called Kirklees Priory. Little John takes him there in the hope that he'll be cured by the abbess. But she betrays him, and what she does is, partly treating his wounds when they used to have bloodletting, she bleeds him to death.
Kirklees Priory is a real place, and it is in Yorkshire. According to the Little Jester, this is the gatehouse where Robin dies. This is believed to be the window where he shot his last arrow. He asks Little John to bury him wherever it lands. And within the priory grounds, there is a mysterious grave.
If you look at the inscription, it's got an oldie English type inscription telling us that Robin Hood was buried here. But the problem is, this is clearly a stylized way in which 19th century romantics thought that oldie English was written. It's not genuine. It was put there in the 1800s.
The text on the headstone is a forgery. The grave is also over 600 metres from the gatehouse. Too far for a longbow shot, even from an alleged medieval master bowman like Robin Hood. But historians have uncovered a period illustration, revealing that a Robin Hood may once have been interred in these grounds.
There is evidence that there was a grave there before the current one that was put there in the 1800s. In fact, as early as the 1600s, people make reference to a grave being there.
Drawn in 1665, it depicts an earlier burial, now replaced by the fake tomb.
On that grave it said, "Here lies Robert Hode." Robin is actually a nickname for somebody called Robert, and Hode, H-O-D-E, is one of the old spellings of Hood. So yes, we do know there was early grave there belonging to a Robin Hood.
The Little Jest tells how Robin dies in Yorkshire. The ballads also connect him to Nottingham and Sherwood Forest. But there is documented evidence to suggest that a real Robin Hood not only died, but actually lived in Yorkshire. The county has archives dating all the way back to the Middle Ages, and one place in particular, called Wakefield, records a Robert Hood. In these ancient rolls is proof that a Robin, or Robert, Hood did exist.
This dates from the year 1309. And here we have two references here to Robert Hood of Wakefield. Now, this is written in medieval Latin, but we have here a translation made by the Yorkshire Archaeological Society, and we can see clearly here the first reference says, "Robert Hode drew blood from the wife of Henry Archer, and for this he was fined 12 pence. So he was already a bit of a villain in 1309.
Robert Hode appears a total of 20 times for petty crimes like fighting and poaching, right up to 1322. Robert of Wakefield is a strong candidate for a real Robin Hood, with one significant difference to the fabled Archer. Despite all his indiscretions, there is no record of Robert of Wakefield ever being outlawed. And the legendary Robin Hood always is. Weapons expert Mike Loades thinks the outlaw element of Robin's legend originates not in the 1300s, but earlier in the 1200s.
13th century is particularly interesting. What we find right from the beginning of the century is there are outlaw problems emerging in Britain. And there's even a statute in the late 1260s which is saying that forests have got to be cut back more than 200 yards from the road going into a market town. Now, a market town is obviously somewhere where people are coming and going with money. Prime ambush territory for a brigand.
The 1200s are a time of great unrest in England, epitomised by a civil conflict called the Barons' War. Archers who rebelled are banished from their homes and forced into the forests. Unpopular laws and impoverished people turn fugitives into heroes. This is a time when the king is demanding higher taxes from the poor, creating a breeding ground for desperados. This helps place him in the 1200s. and a book just discovered in Eton College Library backs up the time frame. Julian Luxford is a manuscript expert responsible for this latest find.
The newest piece of evidence is an inscription in a history book, and it mentions that Robin was a hardened criminal and that he and his accomplices infested Sherwood and other law-abiding regions of England with continuous robberies. It says that he did this sometime between 1294 and 1299.
A criminal called Robin Hood, recorded in the late 1200s. But this document is significant for more than just a date.
Why it's interesting and useful is that it takes him seriously as an actual historical figure. It's not like the ballads, which are essentially folk tales and which don't bother to try and prove his historical existence. This is a document which says this guy lived at this time and this is what he did at this time.
Dr. Luxford also thinks this Robin may not be the original outlaw.
By the mid-13th century, you get criminals being called a Robin Hood, so it's a sort of nickname being applied to or adopted by criminals. Now, it's extremely unlikely that this name would be just invented out of nothing. There was a criminal called Robin Hood, probably in the early 13th century, who was sufficiently notorious to then pass his name on, as it were, to later criminals.
It's a time when fugitives are stripped of their possessions. When found guilty, money would be taken by the local sheriff and given to the king. Records of these financial transactions still exist. If an outlaw Robin terrorised Yorkshire in the early 1200s, he'll be listed in here. Archivist David Crook thinks he may have found him.
The Yorkshire account of 1226 mentions a man called Robert Hood, who is a fugitive from justice, and his chattels, that is the movable goods he left behind when he fled, are accounted for by the sheriff. So that's why they appear in this account. Written
in Latin shorthand, it's still possible to make out the name of England's most famous outlaw.
In 1227, some very strange happens. The name Robert Hood, which appears in the original entry, appears again, but it's in a different form. It's changed by the clerk who wrote the roll to Hobby Hood.
As he gains notoriety, this may be when Robert Hood first acquired a nickname.
I think the person who wrote the roll had heard some sort of story or legend, growing legend, about a man called Robert Hood, and changed the name to Hobby Hood, a sort of pet form.
The rolls are written in Westminster, London, but Robin lives over 250 kilometres away in Yorkshire. It seems this man is infamous. In a time when most information passes by word of mouth, his reputation spreads across England in the space of a year.
I think that this is probably the real Robin Hood, yes, indeed.
So experts have identified two authentic Robin Hoods. Both are from Yorkshire. An outlaw, Robert Hood, who lived in the 1200s, and Robert Hood of Wakefield, almost 100 years later. But there is a final historical character which ties these two men to the legend. The villain of the ballads. The Sheriff of Nottingham.
Who was Sheriff of Nottingham at the time of Robert Hood of Wakefield in the 1320s? Well, it was a man called Henry de Forkenberg. And he was, interestingly, not only Sheriff of Nottingham, but Sheriff of Yorkshire as well.
Henry de Forkenberg spans both Yorkshire and Nottingham, and there is reason why Robert of Wakefield might have hated him.
Henry was something, in his younger days, of a scoundrel. He was something of a poacher turned gamekeeper. And in fact, the Wakefield rolls mention him 4 times getting into trouble at pretty much the same time as Robert Hood.
The town is small. With Robert of Wakefield and Henry committing felonies at the same time, they could once have known each other as equals.
I think with Henry de Forkenberg, we have a real good candidate for the Sheriff of Nottingham, because he is somebody who could have had great rivalry with the most likely candidate, in my opinion, for Robin Hood.
If Robert of Wakefield is at odds with the Sheriff of Nottingham, our outlaw Robert Hood also has a connection to a local sheriff. His adversary is called Eustace of Loudham. He's the Sheriff of Yorkshire, but his hometown of Loudham is right next to Nottingham. As well as Yorkshire, Eustace has also been Sheriff of Nottingham. 2 documented Robert or Robin Hoods. One is an outlaw, the other a petty criminal from Wakefield, both with links to the Sheriff of Nottingham. Although romanticised in the ballads, elements of the stories tally with factual accounts in the lives of these historical characters. The adventures of these men are now celebrated as part of the constantly evolving legend of Robin Hood, one of the classic tales of good versus evil.